Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Worst Star Trek Episodes. This video is part of a series of videos where I name my 10 least favorite, in my opinion, the 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. Over 500, 600 episodes. I have narrowed it down to two that encapsulate the absolute worst of this massive franchise, which of course I do love, which is why I talked about it. But there's some negative aspects to it, and I'm talking about the absolute worst aspects of it. So, getting into my number two, my second worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, that has to be The Fight, which is episode 19 of season 5 of Star Trek Voyager. Now, I mentioned before when I did my number 3 that the top 3 I am deadpan certain about. I am like 100% solid. I don't think I'm going to change my mind that these are the absolute worst of the worst. In fact, the only doubt I have about ranking this episode at number 2 is that maybe it should be number 1. Now, this is a bit contradictory to when I did my worst Voyager episodes, because I actually had this at number 2 for Voyager, and I had In-Game, the series finale, as my number 1 worst episode of Voyager. But I talked about that when I did my review on Endgame, which landed at number 7 on my top 10 worst list. That I do believe Endgame is the worst series finale ever made. I do believe Endgame is a really terrible episode, and in fact I think I would call it the worst Voyager episode, because it does the most harm to Voyager itself. It ends the show in a very, very, very crappy way, which really damages the show. But when I look at overall, like, worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise and take everything into account, I think The Fight beats it out. Now, it's funny because a lot of people point to Threshold as the worst Voyager episode, and in fact a lot of people expected it to be my top 10 worst, or a lot of people would say that it's worse than this episode here, The Fight. But I talked about Threshold when I did my introduction to the top 10. I don't think it's a good episode. I do think it is definitely one of the worst of Voyager. It made my top 10 worst for Voyager. But to me, that episode is mostly just mediocre until you get to that ending, which is shockingly bad. And to me, that doesn't qualify it to be one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. And an episode like this, which, to me, in my opinion, this episode is just fundamentally flawed. I would say this is perhaps even more so than my number 1 worst. The biggest failure and the worst written episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. Now, part of the reason why I had this ranked at number 2 for Voyager and not number 1 is I was also taking into account the enjoyment factor, because watching Endgame, the series finale, is very excruciating to me, especially the Chakotay 7 scenes. I just want to slip my wrist during that bullshit. And I don't like doing it. And it's very annoying, it's frustrating how terribly they ended this great show. But with The Fight, I actually do take enjoyment out of watching this terrible episode. And so that's also part of the reason why, and it did give me, I must be honest, it did give me a bit trepidation in putting it as my second worst of the entire Star Trek franchise, because I actually get some enjoyment of laughing at how terrible it is. But that doesn't make it a good episode. In fact, that just accentuates how terrible it is that I can mock it like that. So it's just like no one would, well, not some people might, but most people, let me rephrase, most people wouldn't refer to The Room as a good movie, even though they take enjoyment from watching it and go to screenings and throw shit at the at the screen. They do it because it's a terrible movie. Now, and speaking of The Room, I think now is a good time to talk about So Bad It's Good. And this is something I mentioned on my channel before, that I've never been one for So Bad It's Good. In fact, I think this is probably my first jocular reaction to watching something that was just so terrible in my life. When I saw this in the late 90s, I think it was 99. Because, yeah, I saw this episode for the first time in 99. I think this came out in 98, if I recall. I'm sure I can look this up. But anyway, I missed this episode. No, it came out in March of 99, but I saw it later that year. So, when this episode came out, I was like, yeah, I saw it towards the end of 99. But when this episode first came out, I didn't see it. I missed it because I was just busy and I missed a lot of the Voyager stuff that was coming on. But I went to New Zealand in late 1999 to be with my, at the time, fiance who lived in New Zealand. And I basically didn't have a working visa or anything or any money really, so I had to just stay at home while she went to work. And I was really, really bored. But this video store, local video store, this is 99, they actually had a Blockbuster. Remember this? But anyway, this Blockbuster had, in New Zealand, it was different than the ones in the US, but it had the entire collection of Voyager on VHS, which I think was actually a British thing. They didn't really have this in the US, where they had 2 episodes per VHS, and they had the entire collection. They didn't have Deep Space Nine, which disappointed me, but they had, or Next Generation for that matter, but they had Voyager. So when I was sitting at home bored with nothing to do, I rented a bunch of these Voyager episodes that I had missed when they first aired, and this was one of them. And yes, I had a fun time with this one. Now, okay, so getting back to my relationship with So Bad It's Good. It's not my thing. I actually met someone in, I think, 2001 who was really into Ed Wood movies and that sort of thing. And I said, well, I like watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, and this friend was like, no, I hate Mystery Science Theater 3000 because I don't like the robots. I just like to watch the bad shit and laugh it on my own. I'm like, but I don't know. I don't get that. And also, in particular, with The Room, which would become much, much later. I learned about that when I went to film school, where everyone was saying, hi, Mark. Oh, hi, Mark, to me all the time. And I got sick of hearing it, so got the reference that was from The Room. But in that case, I did watch The Room, but honestly, I mostly found it boring. I mean, there were a few parts that were really funny, but they're mainly, you can find the clips on YouTube. Like, I did not hit her! Like, that's funny, okay, but most of the movie was just boring. But here's the thing with laughing at So Bad It's Good movies, particularly modern ones like that have just had a low budget, because I think that's low hanging fruit. I think that's a really low blow. It's people who are sincerely trying to make something, but they're not very good at their craft, or they don't have the proper budget, or in this case both. And I think it's actually kind of bullying, honestly. And now, what's his face? Tommy Wiseau, of course, made a career out of it, and he's become famous, so he's all for it now. But there's always this element in my back of my mind that he understands, even though he tries to pretend he doesn't, that people are laughing at him and not with him. And I don't know. There's just a cruel element to that, even though I will still say the "oh hi Mark" a lot. And I did not hit her. I will still make jokes about it, but generally speaking, I don't like watching So Bad It's Good, especially modern movies. Now, older movies like the ones that have Mystery Science Theater 3000, that's low-hanging fruit, because you're looking at something that's outdated, that the technology and filming techniques and profession has advanced since then, And it's like, well, I do some of that with the original series, if I'm being fair. Like that episode, The Enemy Within, when they had two versions of Kirk fighting, and one of them is very obviously a much older, fatter stuntman. And they have this Cocker Spaniel with like horns taped to its head, and like, what is this strange creature? Like, okay. Again, and as I said, I like watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, where they make fun of these older, outdated movies. Okay, so I do get some enjoyment out of that, but again, that's kind of low-hanging fruit because you're picking on outdated stuff. Now, circling around back to the fight. Even though, like, okay, unless you count Mystery Science Theater 3000, which I don't, because it's a comedy show where there's two comedians making jokes. To just sit down and watch a movie without that comedic element to it and laugh at it because it's so terrible, this is the first time I generally did that. And particularly, like, I was starting to get a bit, in the mood for humor throughout, like, most of this episode, because it's pretty terrible. But that ending, that ending really got me. It's like someone, like a 12-year-old who, like, heard of Star Trek or, like, seen a couple episodes, was like, oh, so this is but I had no understanding of, like, how writing works or how Star Trek works or why those other episodes they watched were that way or why they worked. It's like them trying to reproduce reproduce what made it work with, and just doing the worst possible job you can imagine. Now, I'll get more into more detail about that later on. But so comparatively to something like The Room, for example, why is it okay for me to laugh at this episode and not The Room? Is because The Room, a lot of people were, it's got terrible production value. And to me, that's like kind of bullying someone who just doesn't know the craft. Like the audio, for example, the lips aren't synced very well, and it's got a lot of poor production quality. It's just not put together well. Just like every other episode of Voyager or Star Trek in general, beyond Next Generation. It has excellent, beyond Next Generation Season 3, I should say. But when it has excellent production value, I was going to say excellent acting, but let me rephrase it. Excellent actors. The acting is not good. It has excellent actors and excellent production value, and the special effects are good. The sound design is great. The visuals are good. So all of that's great. But the script and the dialogue is just it's just amazing how terrible it is. And to me, I think it's more fair to laugh at something like that and to point out how, especially when you have a show that's actually really good, like Voyager, that has produced some of the best dramatic pieces I've ever seen ever, especially in sci-fi, like Timeless or Remember or Blink of an Eye, Year of Hell, stuff like that. So this is a top quality show. So I think it's more fair to laugh at a top quality show who produces masterful pieces of art when they completely fuck up, as opposed to someone like Tommy Wiseau who doesn't really understand filmmaking and is just a novice. And especially, I didn't even get into the stuff like Sharknado and Birdemic, which is meant to be funny. Like that stuff, if they're trying to be so bad it's good, I absolutely don't find it funny. It's just, oh yeah, they're trying to be ridiculous. Who cares? But, I mean, some people are into that, and if you are, good on you, but that has zero appeal to me. But this, as I said, it's great production value, and it's in a show that's amazing, that's produced some of the best works of fiction ever. I think it's fair game to laugh when they get it. It's like when they fuck up this badly. And again, most people will point to Threshold for that example, but to me, Threshold was just like someone. The writers were like smoking weed, like, hey man, wouldn't it be cool if Paris and Janeway turned to salamanders at the end? Yeah, man. So that was more of an oddity to me. It's more of like a, what the hell were they smoking when they wrote this kind of thing, where this is like the craft at its absolute worst. Now, okay, so enough of the preamble. Let me get into more specifics about this episode. And I just realized again I forgot to give my synopsis for this episode. So this episode, I'm 15 minutes in, but anyway, this episode is when Chakotay thinks he's a boxer, but it's really some aliens trying to communicate with him through his boxing somehow, and in order to instruct Voyager how to get out of chaotic space, which they're stuck in and will destroy them. I just laugh whenever I think about this episode. Okay, so this episode is number 1 worst on IMDb. It's higher than Threshold. So I've heard some people complain about it, but you know me, I think that's absolutely correct. A lot of reviewers have panned this episode. It's Screen Rant, I believe, had it in its top 15 worst of the entire Star Trek franchise. I think it didn't crack their top 10, so I disagree with that. I think it should have, but still. And there's been other mentions of it being the convention I've talked about before in Las Vegas, that voted on 10 worst episodes. This made the cut for that as well. So this is generally considered one of the worst episodes of the franchise. But the funny thing is, and I talked about this in some of the other episodes of my worst list about the writers involved hating it. That was the case with The Muse and with Precious Cargo. Brendan Burke had tried to convince Rick Berman not to air the episode because it was so terrible, and the writer came up with the idea for the episode, said that he thought he was going to get fired because of it. And other episodes in my top 10 had similar things, but that's not the case with this episode. I couldn't find an example of anyone involved in making this episode speaking poorly of it. Robert Beltran, of course the actor who plays Chakotay, once named this as, along with a bunch of other episodes, named this as one of his favorite episodes that he did. Now, he's looking at it from more of a performance, like what was this like shooting the episode, rather than how well the episode is structured in the final result. And the writer, I think Joe Manoski, who didn't come up with the idea, but he ultimately penned the episode, said that he felt that the ending sequence, he did speak kind of poorly of the episode, because he did say he didn't think it didn't all come together right, but he did say he felt the ending sequence where Chakotay was communicating with the aliens was actually really good in its own right, and was sort of a really well structured scene. And I think that's the most ridiculous scene of the entire. That's the worst thing about the entire episode. And I don't know. So most people didn't really speak that poorly. Now, okay, so. Like, what is wrong with it? This is another example of, like, the Enterprise theme song, which the writer still won't apologize for, which, yes, fuck that theme song is the worst thing Star Trek ever did, even worse than this episode. But anyway, I'm sorry, off topic again. So, let me get about the writing in this episode. So this, again, I'm going to do some Rick Berman bashing. It's just the more I hear about the man, the more I realize how much he's ruined Star Trek, and Voyager in particular. You could say he has a lot to do with Star Trek's success, particularly in the 90s, but he did really fuck a lot of things up. I mean, a lot. And I think I hold him solely responsible for its demise in the 2000s. Not fan fatigue. I think that's bullshit. It was Rick Berman. But anyway. Rick Berman. Okay, so there was a writer, Michael Taylor, who wrote he came up with the idea for the Deep Space Nine episode, The Visitor. And he wrote the final draft, or helped write the final draft. He didn't come up with the idea, but he helped write the final draft of In the Pale Moonlight. What do those two episodes have in common? How about they're some of the most beloved episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise? Anyway, he joined the writing staff of Voyager, and he wrote, I believe, trying to Counterpoint, which I do love that episode as well, and Bride of Chaotica, which more mixed feelings about that episode, but it was funny. Anyway, he came up with the idea for this episode. Now, at first you might be like, whoa, Mark, you just said he's an amazing writer, helped these awesome episodes, and he came up with the idea for this crap? Well, let me finish. So, it's definitely was the idea he came up with was not this. Make that clear. So, the idea he came up with was to have, like, someone in the 21st century who was, like, starting to go insane because aliens are trying to communicate with them, and they couldn't handle it. And somehow that person was linked to Chakotay, who also starts going insane in the Voyager timeline because aliens are trying to communicate with them. And now this is what I heard secondhand. I just read this from Joe Manansky. So that idea as it stands, it doesn't really make much sense to me, and that's just how he explained it. So I didn't really get it. But so it could be a great idea, it could not. But because I don't have the full pitch and I don't really understand exactly what they're saying. But point is, Joe Manansky described it as a really, really, really detailed and developed script. With, like, it wasn't full script, it was a script idea, but he described it as much more developed than most script ideas, like footnotes and sidebars and everything. So that actually does make me, especially this guy came up with the idea for The Visitor and helped write In the Pale Moonlight. I fucking trust him. So that makes me believe that it probably was a really great idea. So this is where Rick Berman comes in. Rick Berman sees the script and, like, this is bullshit, intellectual bullshit, you have to have a doctor's degree in order to understand it, fuck this, and rejected it because it was too smart. See, that alone makes me think that this would have been the best episode of the fucking Voyager. Anyway, so Brennan Braga decided, well, hey, why don't we revisit this idea, but we'll dumb it the fuck down. Of course, he didn't use that terminology, but this is essentially what he did. We'll dumb it the fuck down so that Rick Berman will accept it. Now we enter the idea of Chakotay being a boxer. Now, a lot of people, I've watched and read a lot of reviews who cite the idea of Chakotay being a boxer coming from his actor Robert Beltram, but I also read a direct quote from Robert Beltram, who said that's actually not the case, that he's often miscategorized as coming up the idea of Chakotay being a boxer. He said what actually happened is that he went out to lunch with some of the writers like Joe Manansky, Brennan Braga, and I believe there was someone else, and they pitched the idea to him of Chakotay being into boxing, and he was all for it. So, not necessarily, it wasn't his idea, he just agreed to it. But regardless, what Robert Beltram said was, okay, I'll do some boxing, but give me some, notice so I have time to get in shape. They didn't give him any fucking notice. They're like a week from shooting. They're like, okay, we're doing a boxing episode. And he's like, what? So that's why he doesn't look like he's in the best shape, because they kind of fucked him over. But anyway, now, Okay, so let me pivot now to talk about this idea of Chakotay being a boxer. So, I don't think there's anything wrong at its core. I think it's the execution that is horrid. Now, I think this was a problem that was common in Season 5 of Voyager, because I think Season 5, and I talked about this a lot, after Season 4 of Voyager, which was the golden year of Voyager, is like a masterpiece. The writers didn't really have any idea of what all these characters were. In Season 5, they're trying to redefine them. And what happens is they end up giving them a lot of traits that seem out of place. And they are, because they're just made up. Like, they make B'Elanna suicidal. They make Janeway, like, misanthropic and just hiding in her quarters because she just regrets something that happened 4 fucking years ago. And they make Harry Kim, like, angsty teenage, fuck you, mom, horn dog. And they make Chakotay a boxer. And they make... also they make Tom Paris loves the ocean all of a sudden, which is something in, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which never was ever mentioned before. So, they really didn't understand the characters. They didn't know what to do with them. And in Season 6 and 7, they just, decided not to do anything with them and make them all cardboard cutouts and just focus on the Doctor and 7 and 9 and make it the Doctor and 7 and 9 show and fuck all these other characters. But anyway... Season 5, they were trying to reinvent the characters instead of building off of what was already established, which is my huge gripe with Season 5, which I talked about in my Season 5 review. Now, and that's what makes this whole thing of Chakotay being a boxer so terrible, is that it seems out of nowhere. This is the main thing. It's like, what? Chakotay's in the boxing? Okay. Now, let me explain. Let me give you an example from Next Generation. Because, again, there's nothing wrong with the idea of Chakotay liking boxing. It's the execution that's terrible, and same with all the other examples I gave. Now, so let me give a comparison for the Next Generation. For example, Picard is into archaeology. He loves archaeology. So, this was first touched on, I believe, the first time we touched on it was the 3rd season episode, The Booby Trap, which was about the Enterprise being stuck in amber and these weird things fucking with the Enterprise. And Picard was... So the main part wasn't about archaeology, but it was about this ancient ship that Picard was, fascinated by because of his archaeological, leanings. So it wasn't the main point of the episode. It was just a sidebar that was just casually mentioned that has in passing. And it was touched on more in episodes like Captain's Holiday, where again it wasn't the main point that he's into archaeology. It just came up. He met the archaeologist Vosh, and they were going on a dig or whatever, but it was more about the adventure. And it came up again in Cupid, which the main point of the episode was Q taking them the shoreward force and having them act like Robin Hood, but it was a sidebar that Picard had to go to this archaeology conference beforehand. And then when you get to season 6, you get the episode The Chase, where the entire episode is about archaeology. It's about Picard meeting his mentor, who wanted him to become an archaeologist, but Picard decided to become a starship captain instead. And then when he dies, Picard wants to finish his work, and he goes on this, expeditious chase to find all the, artifacts. So it's very archaeology based. So, point I'm making here is why Picard's interest in archaeology works, and you buy it and you believe it. It's because it was slowly interwoven into the character over time. Not from the get-go, because it wasn't mentioned until season 3, unless I'm forgetting something. But they kind of weaved it in casually, in and out, and to the point where you got to a late season or late series episode, like season 6 episode The Chase, where they could full on focus and you completely bought it and you're fine with it. Now, this thing, what they're doing with Chakotay loving boxing, if the analogy would be if the chase was the first time we ever mentioned anything about Picard liking archaeology. They never made the references in the Booby Trap or Captain's Holiday or Cupid or any other references that I'm forgetting. None of those exist. It's just there's no mention of archaeology whatsoever for 5.5 years, and all of a sudden Picard has this professor showing up saying, "Oh, you were going to be an archaeologist," and then Picard's like, "Oh, I love this archaeology thing." Your reaction, or at least my reaction, would be, "What the fuck is this shit? Picard's not into archaeology. What? This is terrible writing." And that's my reaction with Chakotay and boxing. There was no mention. Like, they didn't even have to, they could have a throwaway line. Oh, Chakotay said, like, "Oh, I went in the gym and did the boxing thing," or, "Oh, I enjoyed this fighting or boxing," or whatever. There was zero indication that he had any interest in boxing whatsoever. And all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, this is my main thing. I like boxing." And by the way, never comes up again. Well, okay. There's one very brief mention of it in the episode Zinkate, which is the Rock episode, when Dwayne the Rock Johnson appears for a brief cameo, where it's about this, illegal wrestling league that Seven of Nine is forced into with some Hirogen played by Martok. But anyway, in that episode, Chakotay has interest in watching these fighting matches because he's interested in, and so that harkens back to his interest in boxing. But that's it. That is the only continuation. Otherwise, it is just self-contained. But even if it did continue afterwards, it wouldn't justify this episode because there's no build-up to it, no mention to it whatsoever. It's just all of a sudden he's into boxing, and it's unbelievable. You, as a viewer, as a writer, you do not, not as a writer, but as a consumer of the story, you don't believe it. You don't buy it. It seems jarring because it's terrible writing. Because it's very contrived that they're like, "Oh, all of a sudden he's into boxing," when you've been seeing this character for 5 fucking years. And this is the main difference. You can you can have this episode. You don't have to have the preamble. If it's in season 1, or maybe even season 2, you could get away with it. But because it was like, okay, we don't know this character that well, we're just getting to know him. He likes boxing, that's fine. But you've been with this character for 5 fucking years, and then all of a sudden he's interested in something he never mentioned before. That's bullshit. And that's why The Chase has a season 6 episode, a late series episode, works, because there's build-up. If there was no build-up and all of a sudden he had archaeology after 6 fucking years, you'd be like, "No, that is bullshit. Picard's not into archaeology. There was no mention of this whatsoever." So anyway, okay. Why do I think this episode's so terrible? It's that it's funny. Okay, so let me get into the crux of the matter here. This episode, as I mentioned at the top, it is trying to do what other episodes did, but just failing miserably. Alright, first of all, it's got another bullshit anomaly. The chaotic space. And I actually laugh at this chaotic space, because this is like, they just don't give a fuck anymore. Like, the Voyager writers, let's just throw in some word, like, what's dangerous? Chaos? Oh, let's just call it chaotic space. There's absolutely no basis for this in science whatsoever, first of all. I mean, there are other examples of anomalies like that. Some I forgive because they lead to interesting stories. This does not. This is not well thought out, because it leads to interesting stories because they do something interesting with it, like the anomaly in Cause and Effect that causes a time loop, or the anomaly in Yesterday's Enterprise that causes the timeline to change. And there's other examples of anomalies, like the anti-time anomaly in All Good Things, and that's nonsense. Anti-time, that's no scientific basis, but All Good Things is an amazing episode, so you're like, fine, yay, anti-time anomaly, go. But when it's just a lazy, it doesn't, because Anti-Time Anomaly actually led to amazing storytelling. It had great stakes, it involved time travel, it helped Picard explore his character, whereas this is just a throwaway threat of the week. And add to that this is Voyager, and Voyager has been doing this anomaly, blah, 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 as I call it, bullshit all the fucking time. They really overuse this trope. Even though it was already overused in the Next Generation. So this is wearing really thin by this time, especially when you get up to season 5 of Voyager. And they just don't give a fuck anymore. They're just like, oh, it's chaotic space. You don't care. I don't care. It's just something I've seen a billion times before. I don't give a fuck about it. Also, the fact that this episode is kind of the plot of Night Terrors. A bit. It is the plot of Night Terrors. Just done a lot fucking worse. Now, Night Terrors is the Next Generation episode where the Enterprise is caught in another BS anomaly, and everyone starts going crazy, and because they can't reach our aim in sleep, which actually isn't a thing, but regardless, they start going crazy, and but it's because the alien is trying to communicate with Troy, and it causes everyone else to go insane, but Troy is just trying to figure out what the hell the alien's trying to say to communicate with them, which, I mean, there are differences, because in this episode, it's not the entire crew that goes crazy, it's just Chakotay. But it's the result of alien trying to communicate with them because they're trapped in this space and they're trying to get them rescued. And in the case of Night Terrors, the other aliens trying to communicate with Troy were also trapped in this space, and they wanted to help each other get out. Whereas in when the fight, the aliens aren't trapped in the space. They live there, but they can recognize that Voyager is in danger, and they're going to help them get out. So tomato. Unlike, it's tweaked a bit, but it's essentially the plot of Night Terrors, which is part of what I was referring to at the top of this video about this episode, just trying to emulate other episodes, but doing a much worse and lazy job at it. But let me address the main thing I want to talk about. The elephant in the room. It's taking me this long to get to it, and that's the fight scene, which I can't even think about without laughing. At the end of the episode, so let me set the scene for you a bit. Chakotay, they're trapped in this chaotic space, bullshit. And the ship is going to get destroyed, and Chakotay starts going crazy, and he's thinking that he's boxing because they activated his crazy gene. I don't even know if we're going to address that. I don't even know if we're going to go there. But crazy gene. But anyway, they activated his crazy gene, so he's having these hallucinations, which are some of the worst dream sequences like ever seen, ever. I mean, it is room quality. The room quality, I should say. Not getting confused with the great movie. Let's talk about the horrible one. But anyway, so, and everyone just thinks that Doctor thinks it's just a problem with the Chakotay, that he's gone insane. But it turns out it's a result of these aliens trying to communicate with them. But in order to fully communicate with the aliens, he has to go full on into the fight. Like, there's a lot of boxing metaphors throughout this episode. Like, when they're building up to it, Boothby, his trainer, is like, oh, you got to prepare yourself for the fight, and Chakotay's like, I'm not ready, and he's having these delusions that I talked about, which were terrible, where you have Harry Kim and other people like, you're not ready for it, you're gonna lose the fight, and then when Chakotay wants to get into the ring to fight, the Doctor calls off the match. Like in his hallucination, the Doctor comes in and is like, okay, that's it, I'm calling the fight, which is, oh my god, I laughed at that. That was so ridiculous. But in real life, the Doctor was like, waking him up or injecting him with drugs to make him not hallucinate. And so he's like, you gotta let me in the fight, I can take him. And so so stupid. And so it all builds up to them realizing that it's the aliens trying to communicate with Chakotay, so they let him go into the fight so that he can communicate with the aliens and find out a way to get out of chaotic bullshit space. So they go into the ring, and his opponent is Kid Chaos, which is like he's wearing the boxing robe and has the gloves on, but inside it's like it looks like chaotic space. It looks like a black hole-ish thingy. And this is when I started losing my shit. I don't think words I could properly articulate just how fucking stupid I find that. It is just a level of terrible that I think is beyond my ability to properly communicate with you. I mean, if you don't get it, if you watch this episode and you're like, what? It's just a guy in a robe with a black hole as a face. What's wrong with that? Then I don't think I can get to you. I don't think I can properly explain. My reaction was just to laugh out loud hysterically and be like, what the hell? Alright, let me try to put it to you in these terms if you don't understand. It would be like your reaction to Threshold when you saw the Thou Salamanders. That was my reaction to seeing this guy in chaotic space in a boxing room. It's such bad writing! It is such terrible writing. In fact, I think, again, it's worse than the Salamanders because that's just what the fuck are they doing that's out there, where this is not more of, oh, what are they smoking? It's more of, how stupid are they? How badly did they fuck up? How bad of a writer are you? No. But it gets worse. It gets much worse. So, and this is when I lost my shit. I was rolling on the floor laughing, and believe me, I'm not just talking about my first time watching this episode. I'm talking about pretty much every time I watch this episode. I just cannot contain my laughter when they start boxing. Sorry, I don't know if I can get through this. And every time Chakotay like lands punches on the Kid Chaos, the chaotic space black robe, they flash to flashes of that have like snippets of people Chakotay knows, mainly people from these visions like Neelix and the Doctor and Tom Paris, and don't want to fork out the money for the guest star, so let's just recycle the main cast members, and they piece together like different words from them to make a sentence. Now, alright, let me pause here for a second, because this is actually a good idea. And I talked about this on my review of the Enterprise episode, Silent Enemy, from Season 1, which I typically don't like Season 1 of Enterprise, but I thought this episode was decent. It was okay. But there's one part of the episode where I loved, where there was this enemy that was like shadowing Enterprise and attacking them, and it wouldn't really communicate with them. And at one point, Archer like tried to give this badass speech, like, you better leave us alone, we can stick up for ourselves, blah blah blah. And later in that episode, the aliens like cut up that speech and used it to like threaten Archer. Like, it showed Archer's own words, but sort of cut up, where Archer says, you are defenseless, surrender, or something like that, which I thought was fucking creepy. Like, that was effectively creeped me out. I think that was really well done. With this, I know I'm talking about something that came out after this, but still, there's other examples. That's just the one I gave, of stuff doing that before this episode came out. And this was trying to do that, but failing so comically bad. So it would cut between like Paris and Neelix and the Doctor and Janeway and various people being, you are in chaotic space. Oh, I had 7 of 9 going chaotic space. You are in chaotic space. You are in danger. If you do not leave chaotic space, you will be destroyed! And okay. It's just alright, so there's reasons why it works. Alright, so let me stop beating around the bush and get to my main point. This is trying to be like the Prophets, particularly from the episode Emissary, the pilot episode of Deep Space Nine, which was, well, I would say amazing episode, but mainly just the part that had to do with the wormhole aliens, because they didn't come up with the idea of them being prophets until later. But anyway, that plot was great, but the side plot with Kira was bullshit. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the stuff with Sisko, which was actually really good. Really, especially his interactions with the wormhole aliens was great. Where the wormhole aliens did take on the form of the main cast members or the other people in the episode, so they didn't have to fork out extra money for guest stars. There were some guest stars, but they were going to be in the episode anyway, so they just reused them here. Where the Prophets took on the form of people, and the fact that multiple versions, every time the Prophets you see them, they take on forms of people that the character knows. Mainly stuff that's actually in the settings that are from that episode. And like in this episode you see Jennifer, because we had a flashback with Jennifer early on. But anyway, they take on forms of people he knows. And sometimes they do jump from... Now, don't do it as ridiculous as it was in the fight, but sometimes they do like finish each other's sentences, and one will start to say something and they'll flash to the different characters finishing the sentence or whatever. But it actually really worked, because the way the Prophets were developed and set up, like, oh, there's these mystery aliens and there's this weird wormhole thingy, and what they were saying to them, like, it was well developed and it was believable, and you totally bought it. This, with the fight, you don't buy it, because first of all, chaotic space is bullshit. There was no setup for these aliens other than, oh, they're trying to communicate with them. And secondly, or the main thing, the boxing element. So I got a question for you. What the fuck does boxing have to do with communicating with aliens? What the fuck does boxing have to do with communication in the first place? This was such a contrived, obvious attempt of them trying to fit these two story ideas together that have absolutely fucking nothing to do with each other. It was trying to be like Emissary with the Prophets, and like Night Terrors, like having the idea, oh, what if the Prophets were the ones in Night Terrors, the aliens trying to help them get out of anomaly bullshit, and boxing. And they're trying to say, oh, let me get into the ring. And so every time he punched, there would flash just, someone saying, you are in chaotic space. And that's when I lost my shit. That is just so hilariously, outrageously bad. And again, I'm sure someone will throw up the straw man, oh, you just don't like boxing, or what do you have against boxing? It has nothing to do with my opinion on boxing whatsoever. Like, I can watch a boxing movie or a boxing theme thing and think it's fine if they tell a great story around it. But here, boxing was clearly out of place. Clearly had nothing to do with anything, and the way they tried to contrive it into this plot that didn't fit. What the fuck does punching, every time he punches someone, the aliens talk to him, and they have the boxer with the kid Chaotica that was a black hole in the boxing room? I mean, what the fuck? This isn't like a Salamander thing where it's like, what the fuck were they thinking? This is like, I know what they were thinking, but they failed! This is terrible writing! It is so hilariously and outrageously bad. I just lost my shit when I first saw this, that they were trying to emulate the Emissary but doing such a piss poor shitty job at it, and trying to contrive boxing into it, like every time you punch you are in chaotic space. What the fuck does talking to aliens have to do with boxing? It has nothing to do with boxing. Nothing. And I'm sorry, but getting into the setup for this episode, where it was about Chakotay being like, "Get me into the ring, I can take him," again, like, that has nothing to fucking do with communicating with aliens. Like with the Night Terrors, when the people were going crazy, you bought it because they're seeing, like, that was done well. Picard was in the turbo lift and it looked like it was collapsing, and it was like, no! And even get to the part where Beverly Crusher was in, like, with all the dead bodies and they sit up. That was creepy as fuck. Compare that to Chakotay being like, "Get me in the ring," or like those terrible fucking dream sequences where Terry Kim was like, "I looked up to you as a mentor and you let me down." I mean, again, this is an example of some of the absolute worst writing I've ever seen in Star Trek ever, because they're trying to be like other things and they're just failing, like, so hard, so miserably. Like those dream sequences were just absolutely terrible. And the whole thing about the crazy dream and him seeing his grandfather, who also had the crazy gene, and he was like, the grandfather was like, "Oh, I don't think so. I'm gonna go where my spirit wants to." It's like, there was a terribly written scenes as well. But then you had the opening scene where Chakotay was like, "No! Make it stop!" And I'm sorry, a lot of other critics I read who bashed this episode focus on how much Chakotay sucks. I actually don't have a problem with Chakotay. I have a problem with how the writers handled Chakotay, particularly in the last 3 seasons. This is a prime example of that. But I think the character could be used well. Like, Timeless is a great example. Both Chakotay and Harry Kim, who are both characters that are often mishandled. And I hear a lot of people cite them as their terrible flat characters, but they're not. I disagree. I think the characters, there's nothing wrong with the characters themselves. There's something wrong with the writers who didn't know what the fuck to do with them in the last 3 seasons. Like the early season 4, great. We won't talk about season 3. Season 2, 1, also great. They knew what to do with these characters. But here, like, so I don't think it's Chakotay's fault. I don't think it's Robert Beltram's fault. He was obviously giving a really terrible script, and with a terrible director, and started putting out these hammy performances that you did not buy. Now, part of the reason, to be fair, why you totally don't buy and why his acting seems so terrible is because of the writing. Because they didn't set up the situation. They didn't make it believable. They didn't make it interesting. They just made it silly and goofy. And so you have Chakotay being like, trying to act all crazy and be like, "No, they want to talk to me. Let me in the ring." I just lose my shit. I'm sorry. That's high fucking hilarious because it is so stupid. Sorry, I knocked my camera down. It is so stupid. It's just, again, I can't articulate how dumb, just how utterly ridiculous that is. Now, another thing I gotta talk about with this episode, and this is something I noticed with a lot of other reviews, one in particular really hyper-focused on this aspect, but really I think this is just one small element to why this episode sucks. It's not the main thing. The main thing is that goofy ending when they're trying to be like Emissary and failing so terrible. But anyway, that is the framing device. So there's a framing device where it starts the episode later in the story, which is some episodes do that to some success, and the Pale Moonlight is a great example of that. For example, because there's a framing device of Cisco doing his captain's log, and after the fact, and he tells the story, so it harpens back to the events of the episode. Whereas this framing device was Chakotay in sickbay with the doctor, and this framing device is terrible. It actually detracts from the story because it tells you what's going on before you actually see the events going on. So it's a prime example of tell not show. And the only reason why this framing device exists, and this is something the writers admitted to, is because the episode ran short. Because it's a terrible idea for an episode. So it ran short, and so they needed to... It's actually the dictionary definition of filler. Like, it's literally filler. Because they needed to fill up time to fit the 45 minute or however long mandated time they have. So they're like, oh, what can we do to make this episode longer? Well, let's have to throw in this framing device with the Doctor and Chakotay. And it's complete. And again, this features some of the terrible acting where I'm talking about, where Chakotay is like, let me in the ring, I can take him. Like, it's just terrible to watch. And also, it's inconsistent with one of the other scenes. I didn't notice this until just this rewatch where I read a review and I watched the scene. And I was like, actually, this is right. I think I noticed this kind of subconsciously, but I didn't know the reason why, that there was a mismatch of scenes. These scenes were obviously filmed afterwards. But anyway, what I'm talking about is towards the end, the Doctor, when Chakotay is like having his fight with the Kid Chaotic. And the Doctor like grabs him and like, you have to listen to the aliens, you need to trust yourself, blah 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 blah. And Chakotay's like, okay, and he goes up to the bridge because the aliens tell him how to get out of chaotic space, bullshit. So he goes up to the bridge, and once he's on the bridge, the Doctor's like trying to talk him out of it, trying to tell Janeway not to let him do anything. She's like, he's hallucinating, don't listen to him. And I'm like, but wait a second, you just told him to trust in himself and listen to the aliens, and so he goes to do something and you follow him and you tell him not to do it and you try to get other people to stop him. What? And that's because, again, the scenes with the Doctor were filmed afterwards. So originally the Doctor, there was a different scene where the Doctor thought Chakotay was being delusional, and so that scene on the bridge was filmed with the intent to follow that scene to make sense that the Doctor was thinking that he's being delusional. So it's just... Now, I do disagree again with those reviews who highlight this as the issue with the episode. To me, it's just a tiny little nugget. It is a part of the whole masterpiece that makes this an absolute terror. I think this is definitely the second worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. Anyway, let me roll this to my final thoughts. So my rating for the fight out of 10 is, of course, a 1. I mean, if I could, I'd give it a 0, but I don't want to cop out. It's the worst rating I have. A 1. The worst. It is literally, like, the worst. Now, so, yes, this is definitely the second worst, possibly even the first worst. I mean, I wouldn't put it past me. Like, if someone said, "Oh, Mark, shouldn't this be the absolute worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise?" I don't think I could argue with you. I think there's a good case for this to be the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, because the acting's terrible, mainly due to the writing, which is nonsensical. They have this framing device that's inconsistent, which all this terrible writing. Like, I didn't even approach the Boothby aspect of it, where he's a gardener. Why is he teaching? Why he's being Chakotay's boxing trainer? Why does Chakotay create a holodeck program that has Boothby as his boxing trainer. Like, what sense does that make? It's because he looks like the boxing coach from Rocky, I guess. But anyway, in those scenes, Boothby will just throw out all these like ridiculous, empty platitudes that you see in boxing movies all the time, but much more ridiculous. Where it's like, boxing's about following your heart. It's about trusting your instincts and not fighting your instincts to not get hurt. You have to follow your heart and believe in yourself, and other stupid metaphorical nonsense. And that was also ridiculous. Like, every aspect of this episode is cheesy, ridiculous. The main structure doesn't make any sense. The main plot is just a ripoff of Night Terrors, but done a lot worse. They took what was probably an excellent idea and just sucked out any intelligence, any creativity of it, and tried to emulate other Star Trek episodes that has done this better. By the way, I don't think Night Terrors is a great episode. It's okay at best, and it's still a masterpiece compared to this giant piece of dog shit. But anyway, they sucked out anything. They just had, like, they were lazy, had a lazy anomaly. It's probably the worst example of the laziest anomaly. They had a lazy plot of these underdeveloped aliens who are using boxing to communicate in this crazy gene. And boxing has absolutely fucking nothing to do with communicate. You know, if I were having in a relationship with my spouse and I'm having problems communicating, it's like, oh, we're not getting our feelings across. They don't say, a marriage counselor wouldn't be like, hey, here's your solution. Go in the boxing ring and start boxing. That's the best way to communicate. No, because boxing has fucking nothing to do with communicating. and having these fucking like cut scenes of everyone saying, you are in chaotic space, you will be destroyed, is just, there's a reason why I was losing my shit laughing, because this is it's the absolute worst written script that you could possibly do for a Star Trek episode. The absolute laziest, the poorest writing. They're just trying to emulate other episodes that did it better, like Emissary, and just not giving a shit. Just not even trying. This episode is a triumph in failure. It's a triumph in disaster. It is absolute horrid dog shit. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Fight. I shall be back next week with an episode that, believe it or not, I actually think is even worse than this one. The number one worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. So be sure to check out my channel for that, as well as many more videos on Star Trek. Some of them, believe it or not, very positive. And I also review other shows like The Expanse, Lower Decks, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.